Dr. Dan Mitchell is the chairman of the Center of Freedom and Prosperity. His primary research interests include tax reform, international tax competition, the economic burden of government spending, and other fiscal policy issues. Dr. Mitchell will talk about the economic landscape of the next 50 years, and he will focus mostly around the demographics and the demographic shifts and the challenge they will present to economic development. Dr. Mitchell, the floor is yours, and you have 15 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Mohammed. I'll try to keep on time because we've had so many good speeches already, and I'm looking forward to the discussion and questions. What I'm going to focus on, as you indicated, are the demographics. And I have a presentation, which I will go ahead and call up here, because I think there are so many bits of data that make it impossible not to be concerned about what's going to happen in the future. And I guess the number one thing that everyone should understand, and actually most people that work on these issues with governments do understand it. Unfortunately, the political system isn't quite willing to deal with this issue yet. But the key thing to understand is that demography is destiny, and we're living longer and we're having fewer children. And in many cases, that's good news, but from an economic perspective, from a demographic perspective, and from a fiscal perspective, these are challenging things. I mean, from an economic perspective, we could merely consider the fact that your economic output is largely driven by your working age population. And if we're having fewer children and we're having more and more people living longer among the elderly, that working age population is supporting more and more people. And those demographics, when you mix them with the existing government policies and potential future government policies, this I think is probably one of the more underappreciated issues, because we have the key thing to understand, and then the key consequence is that I think fiscal policy is going to get enormously challenging in the future over the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And reason number one, as I just mentioned, is the demographics. But reason number two is the fact that most nations have some form of tax and transfer programs to support the elderly. And when you mix that with these demographic trends that are already baked into the cake of too few workers, and actually I should have said too many old people, so I have a little typo in my presentation, but that's not a good combination. Here's the traditional population pyramid that we used to see in countries all around the world. A few elderly at the top of the pyramid, a big working age population, and then an even bigger generation of children coming up. And so in that kind of system with the traditional population pyramid, you would have lots of workers to support retirees, and a reasonable sized welfare state was certainly affordable. Whether it was a good idea or not is a whole separate question, but it was affordable. And that, in some sense, is the story of much of the Western world over the last 100 years, is the development and implementation of the tax and transfer programs, largely for the elderly. But my presentation is going to focus on that population pyramid is beginning to change. And I'll show you some data here just from the United States. And you can see the population pyramid. It tops out at 100 years old, but you can see it over time. Now we're in the 21st century. Here's today, and here's what's happening in the future. You see that the pyramid, in effect, is becoming a cylinder. Now that's just for the United States, but let's go to a chart that simply shows a woman on one side, men on the other. It shows the light gray is where things were in 1950 for the entire world. The dark gray is a couple of years ago, and then 2100, the dashed line is where we're going to be in another 80 years or so. And you can see, once again, a triangle has become more of a cylinder, and that has important implications. And what I want to do is now look at a whole bunch of charts that underscore this point. Not because I'm necessarily going to say what the right answer is, but because I think we have to somehow get more in the public mind, more in the public domain, that this is a very serious issue. It's largely being shrugged off by politicians who generally, of course, understandably, they just look their time horizon might be the next election. And this is an issue that is for 10, 20, 30 years down the road. But anyhow, this chart shows young children and older people as a percentage of the population. And you can see, if you look to the left of the screen, it used to be there were a lot more children than there were old people. You look to the right of the screen, which is where we're heading, and you can see that there are a lot more old people than children. And remember, in the context of demography and economics and fiscal policy, young people, children matter because children are future taxpayers. And we're going to have fewer of those future taxpayers. Here's another way of simply looking at the population pyramid becoming a population cylinder over time. It's just a different way of looking at the same data. Again, the idea is to underscore the fact that this is a built-in, very serious, challenging issue, and people aren't paying enough attention to it. Demographers generally say that the replacement rate is 2.1 children for every woman in society. Well, here are just some examples of countries that are well below that 2.1, 1.4, all the way down to 1.2 in South Korea. That's demographic catastrophe, but that's really not the right word, because it's not anybody's business how many children families have and things like that. But it is potentially economically important. And as I keep trying to underscore, it's potentially fiscally catastrophic, because when you have a country like, say, Greece, with a 1.3 replacement rate, they already have enormous levels of government debt. They already have all sorts of major economic and fiscal challenges. And you can see just baked into those numbers are the fact that there are going to be fewer taxpayers in the future to support an aging Greek population. And how does Greece solve that problem when they're already in a position without the European Central Bank that they really wouldn't probably be able to issue any debt into private credit markets? And one of my concerns is that what we have seen in Greece over the last 10 years is what we're going to see in Italy, maybe imminently, and what we're going to see in other developed nations around the world over the next 20 or 30 or 40 years. Here are numbers. On the left side, you have some developing nations. On the right side, you have some industrialized nations. And you can see that the age dependency ratio, the number of dependents for every 100 people of working age, those numbers are really deteriorating in a substantial way. So it's not like there are parts of the world that are exempt from some of these problems. Here's fertility rates, just a different way of looking at the data about how we're having fewer children over time. And again, keep in mind that the 2.0, you want to be a little bit above that simply to have a replacement rate for your population. Of course, this doesn't count immigration. So the US, as a country with a lot of immigration, our population will still be growing. But you can see in the European Union, Spain and Japan in particular, you are seeing replacement rates that the equation for what that means for fiscal policy, I think, is something that has to be dealt with. Here's another way of looking at it that I think is very important. A lot of people might not understand and comprehend what long-term demographic trends mean and population pyramids, but they do understand that how many workers do you have to support every retiree? And it used to be, if you look back on the left side, the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, for the most part, you would have 4 to 5 workers to support every retiree in your countries. And again, keep in mind, we're talking about tax and transfer systems that take money from working age people and give to retirees. But as we go out to the right side of the screen to 2030, 2040, 2050, in some nations like Japan, you're almost getting to the point where you have, for every 5 workers, you have 4 retirees. And that's the implications for what that means in terms of the tax burden for the people who remain in the workforce I think, are very sobering bits of information. Here's some OECD data. You have the blue bar is sort of roughly where we were a couple of years ago, and these black diamonds are where these countries are going to be in 2050. Again, it's the old age dependency ratio. This is a dramatic change. The traditional population pyramid is dying out. or in some sense, the children to support it are not being born, and the old people who used to die out are living a lot longer. And of course, with my gray hair, I like the idea that we're living longer, but I recognize it's a major issue for fiscal policy, for economic policy more broadly. Here's looking at the different regions around the world. And you can see that the combination of the number of working age people and the amount of the elderly, these numbers should frighten policymakers all over the world, because as you get fewer and fewer taxpayers and more people expecting that government's going to take care of them, something's got to give. And I'll actually close up my presentation in 2 minutes looking at that. Here's a map of Europe looking at what's going to happen to population between 2017 and 2050. And pink, red, or dark red, those are all countries where the population is going to decline. But even if you look at the green countries where the population is going to increase, you then have to factor in which population is increasing, because even in the countries where the population is increasing, oftentimes it's simply because you have big baby boom generations that are going to be living into their 80s and 90s, and in some cases, even over 100 years old. And again, it's great that we're all living longer, and there's certainly nothing wrong with people having fewer children. But in the context of the traditional welfare state that was created in the 20th century, this is going to create some major challenges. Here's simply another way of looking at some European Union nations. The red bar is an average for Europe. You can see the yellow circle is where the old age dependency ratio was in 2016, and the red circle at the end on the right side, that's where these countries are going to be in 2070. And I can't look at this kind of data without thinking most nations are not going to successfully deal with that transition. And that creates a very, I think, sobering bit of analysis about what might be happening in the future. Here's simply breaking the world down into more developed countries, less developed countries, and looking at countries with declining population. As you can see, by 2050, 2100, lots of countries are going to have declining populations. But perhaps more relevant for this presentation, on the right side of the screen, you can see that the old age dependency ratio is dramatically moving in a direction that is going to cause some headaches for people around the world. Here's looking at the data just for Asia. And I put this here specifically because this gives you an indication on the right side of the screen what's simply going to happen to pension spending in some of these countries. In a few, it's not going to increase a lot, but in many of these countries, you're going to see dramatic increases of the amount of the economy's output that politicians are going to want to divert to finance the existing tax and transfer programs. And keep in mind, with fewer and fewer working age people, what that implies about tax rates. Here's just another list of some different countries, the ratio of the 65 plus population compared to working age people. Now, obviously, when you're looking at this data, you can begin to speculate, well, what if people work until they're 70 or 75? But unfortunately, we can't really do that, because the trend in the industrialized world is for people to retire earlier, not to work later. So again, it all boils down to the fact that we're facing some challenges. So here's what I think the conclusions are from all this. More people will depend on government, but there's going to be fewer taxpayers to finance it. Now, what does that imply? Huge tax increases, huge debt increases. And of course, there's also a race against time. Will reforms happen quickly enough to avoid sudden, huge economic direct disruptions? I guess when we think about the three potential outcomes, I'll close on this. Politicians can impose much higher tax burdens. They can borrow more money, or they can engage in Singapore-style reform. Of course, there's also a possibility of combining all these things. I'm not sure tax increases will be very successful, especially in a competitive global economy where jobs and investment can migrate across borders, notwithstanding the efforts of the OECD and a few other bureaucracies. I don't think debt is going to be an option because it's already at record levels. And I think that at some point, a lot of investors are just simply not going to trust governments to lend them money anymore, especially when it gets to such a level that they don't trust that central banks can sop up a lot of the debt to prop up those markets. I think personally, Singapore style reform works, but if you look at the bottom of the screen, most politicians don't favor this approach. And even for someone like me who's sympathetic to that approach, there are major transition challenges to making that happen. And unfortunately, I don't, again, I worry politicians don't think past the next election cycle, much less the 10 or 20 years down the road that make these kinds of reforms possible. So the bottom line is I'm expecting trouble in the future. I wish that wasn't the case. But with that, I want to keep on schedule, so I will stop. Thank you very much.